I'm Jim Holland, and this is the third in this quarter's Design at Large talks. And we have a continuing awesome set of speakers. I'm really happy to introduce Ben Frog, who's going to talk to us today about data as a design problem. And Ben is, I guess this is the official kind of stuff. He got his undergraduate degree at CMU. And then moved to MIT, got a master's degree there, got a PhD from the Media Lab. And I think the title of his thesis was Computational Information Design. He's probably best known for being one of the fathers of processing language and software system with Casey Rees. That I think began in their undergraduate and graduate students at MIT. And that's had a tremendous, if you go to processing.org, it's had a tremendous impact. There's a huge community that's moved into JavaScript versions, Python versions, and
Scala, Ruby, it's
yeah, keep going. And so he's written 3 books, 2 on processing, 1 on data visualization. He's got a whole host of awards. My favorite is a National Design Award that was presented to him at the White House and handed to him by Michelle Obama, which I think is pretty cool. And then he started a company, Fathom Information Design, which is a very interesting visualization company. And then I asked some people like Shannon, his wife, and Casey Rees, for some of the dirt. You know, what do we not know about him? And I really can't tell you all of that. They responded in kind of looking for something like a little tidbit about Pat Hanrahan, that he's never taken a computer science course, which I thought was just really great kind of thing. But they told me some things. For example, he has 4 pieces in the permanent collection at the Museum of Modern Art. He plays both the keyboard and ukulele. He makes awesome popovers, I am told. And his earliest design work was for that famous firm, the famous store, Domino's Pizza in Ann Arbor, which he's moved on to. And just to finish up, I think he's one of the sort of a new generation of people in this area of design. There's lots of really great designers, and there's lots of really great software people. But it's incredibly, incredibly rare to have those happen in the same person. And I just hope we see a whole series of folks with that kind of expertise. So.
Thank you. That's way too kind. Domino's Pizza and popovers. All right. That I won't be covering today. So what I'm going to talk about today, obviously, data as a design problem. I'm actually going to show a handful of, actually, a couple of older projects, and hopefully show how we wind up where we are now, and hopefully that'll kind of help tell the story of what we're up to. As Jim mentioned, I did my master's and PhD at the Media Lab at MIT. I was part of this group called the Aesthetics and Computation Group, and everyone in the group had some sort of background that was a mix between some aspect of the visual arts, so art, design, architecture, et cetera, plus some kind of engineering, mathematics, computer science, physics, astrophysics, things like that. And so it was this really interesting sort of playground to work with all these other people who had these dual interests. That for me, I had done design and code as sort of 2 separate things. So the Domino's Pizza job was in high school. I was working as a graphic designer for them, and which paid better than what my friends were doing. But also separately was interested in doing software and would do things in code, and then never really found a good way to merge them until that I was looking at doing UI design and things like that. But it wasn't really until I met John Maida and wound up at the Media Laboratory that I found a way to merge things that, or sort of merge these two sides that came together in a way that made more sense and really got to what I was interested in. When I started there, I started looking at things in terms of, as a designer, what happens when you add code. So instead of, as a designer, you take a set of constraints, you take a set of information, you try and create the best possible representation of it, and as soon as you're done with it, it's actually out of date by the time you're finished. And so, what happens when you can actually work within context of code? And so I started building things like this. This is reading through the text of a book, constructing a network out of it of showing adjacencies between words. The more often certain words are found, they fight their way to the outside. But really, how do you set up a series of rules within the computer science and programming side of it, and then feed information into it. And then as a designer, you're sort of tweaking those rules to get a desired visual result. So this, we're trying to move the more useful things to the outside, give you a better way to read a book or something like that. But really what we're looking at here is trying to see how things change over time. And that at the time, so this is 1999, the most compelling thing about it was really that it was round, it was in 3D, it had type on it, it moved, and so people were kind of responding to that more so than, this is how networks are changing over time, and ways of kind of feeding data into a representation and having it, seeing how that visualization actually metabolized that data. It did wind up in a movie though, so here's Tom Cruise in Minority Report checking his email in 2054 and getting hopefully useful results. Email looks messy. Standard fare in Windows 2054. From there, moved on to looking at genetics. Genetics was interesting as far as for my PhD work, being able to take something that worked in terms of it's a massive data problem. It's also timely that so it was 2000, and so the first draft of the human genome had just been completed. This is something that can kind of give you enough to work on, and also for a couple of years, and also to have something that was really that there's this massive gap between what we understood, what scientists were beginning to understand about the genome, and also what the public understood about the fact that the human genome was now sequenced, or that there was a draft version of that sequence available. And so also that because this was open data, I was able to, even before really making contacts within the genetics community, I was able to start working with the data and start sorting things out with it. Eventually got in touch with folks who were looking at variation data. So this is looking at 500 different individuals, every couple hundred letters, just take those single letter changes, see what kind of groupings and structures we get. And so they would make representations like these. So these are all the same type of data. This is just a redesigned version, just doing the kind of visual cleanup stuff from this to this. That was the first version I did. But then I said, we're really talking about the same data set. And so can we actually link all those representations together? And so building something like this where, here we're going to expand it out and actually be able to read the letters off. Or some people don't like this sort of qualitative, bar chart kind of version. I just want to be able to see these individual percentages. Or we can move it into 3D, and so we can get more of these connections in between the different blocks. But that's also kind of a waste of a dimension. So instead, you can put another set of data on that z-axis, and then having done that, you now have this other diagram that we were just looking at, by being able to look at it from above. And so here, just trying to take ways that would bridge, sort of what was happening within the biology and genetics community, and the types of things we're thinking about in terms of what can you do with interactively working through a visualization. So down in the corner here, we have the statistics that are used to actually, define these different groupings. And so you can actually play with the statistic and have undo and visually be getting feedback on, how well things are going. But also, in order to do that, it means rewriting how that entire piece of software works and how that algorithm works. And so you can't really separate this sort of the design side of things from the that code part of the algorithm that went into and the statistics that went into building this representation. So now we're up to 2004. Along with this, one of the things that Casey and I started doing in 2001 at the Media Lab was this thing called processing. And so what we saw was basically a connection between these projects I was just showing in terms of how we work in our own projects. We want to be able to kind of sketch something out with code and then port it to something more specific. But how do we get a little bit closer to sketching with code? But also, how do we teach other people to do the same, the same kind of work? And so, the group that we were in, Professor Maida always had a significant pedagogical push in terms of it only gets more interesting if we can actually get as many people into the field as possible. And also, I think it only starts getting interesting when you have people who come in who, so you get people coding who aren't naturally, drawn to coding, or that you get people doing design who were more drawn toward engineering. And so how do you start crossing disciplines that way and sort of, well, we'll get into that a little bit. So the result was this processing project that, because we saw this similarity between the way that we would try and teach people to code and the kinds of things that we wanted to be simple with our own work, and the way that we wanted to be able to iterate quickly and kind of write a page of code and see what happened and try out a different idea and then feel okay about throwing it away. And we didn't want to do a whole integrated development environment and things like that. But can we kind of have a way of script, like something that feels like scripting, even though it's more performant underneath or behind the scenes. And so over time, this has just kind of grown a little bit out of control. So this is, as of last month, so the number of people actually using the processing environment, so we're up at about 250,000 people. And so this is exciting as far as just how the range of that, and then all these other projects that kind of, shot out of that as far as, things like Arduino, they've, gone significantly higher than this, but, taking the same kinds of ideas, using the processing development environment to be able to apply that to hardware and so on. And so this is really, and this wasn't Casey or I's research, that this was, sort of our side project. So some of you are trying to finish your PhD now, and don't let this happen to you. The other part is, what I was referring to as far as how we cross people over. So, a couple years ago, we wrote this really important mission statement. So processing project seeks to ruin the careers of talented designers by tempting them away from their usual tools into the world of programming and computation. Similarly, the project is designed to turn engineers and computer scientists to less gainful employment as artists and designers. And it is, to my greatest pride in the project that we've actually been able to do this to some people and sort of like breaking them, which is really kind of exciting. And really the amazing thing that's happened with the project is the community that has built around it. A lot of the majority of the credit for that goes to Casey, who really did an amazing job from the outset, trying to get different people to sort of commission work for it and really building out this exhibition and getting people thinking about different ways of using code. That it's not a matter of making little visual things on screen, but rather 3D printed folding sculptures, kinetic light installations, other vision-based interactive things. And so on processing.org, you should check out the exhibition. Just sort of an amazing range of things that people have built with it.
Would have a lot of time when you go there.
Right.
Hard to read.
Page after page of it. So, and I also use this within my own work as a way of thinking through different ideas or be able to sketch or prototype things that I'm curious about. So a number of years ago, a friend of mine who worked in biology was telling me about how she had been sort of going back to first principles and reading, Origin of Species by Darwin and reading Wallace's paper, so Wallace and Darwin had, kind of come up with the same idea around the same time. And so I was really fascinated about this idea, and she said, well, actually over time, Darwin's Origin of Species actually changed a great deal, that he actually wrote it and rewrote it and edited it. And so I was fascinated about this idea of like, well, one, we can actually see what see this person's thinking and see how that evolution, how that change happens. But also like, what, did Darwin, who is, upper class society, and Wallace, who is not, and did Darwin kind of slowly siphon all of his ideas out of the, the Wallace paper and so on. And so that was fascinating. And so I set out to, build something that would help me look at this and understand it. So as it turns out, the first edition of Origin of Species, and the part of the premise here too is one of the things I love about design, or the thing that I most like about design, is this idea of being able to take any random thing that you're curious about and sort of turn it into work. And so I realized this at some point during my, my freshman year in college. But so here we've got 6 editions of Darwin's Origin of Species over the course of the 6 English language editions that he did. Happened over the course of 14 different years. Over at the left-hand side, it's each edition just written out. So you see it go from about 160,000 words up to about 190,000 words. And this browser here just shows sort of the track changes version of that text. So each column is one edition, and that edition compared with the next. So here's Darwin, cursing his way through Microsoft Word, and sort of trying to figure out his theory of natural selection. And so what we start seeing is, patterns in terms of maybe a third of the changes are actually, substantive and important things that have shifted. Another third are just kind of, a little bit of rewriting, and then another third are actually new material that's coming in. But this is just kind of the diagnostic version of the text. It's, here's the answer to the question: what does a million words look like, and how can we kind of browse through it efficiently on just a typical laptop, which is another interesting thing in terms of design and visualization at this point, where we can just do this very simply on very basic hardware. This is my competitor. So 50 years prior, this guy Morse Peckham actually took the entire text of all 6 editions, wrote it out line by line on index cards, covered his apartment, office, etc., and actually produced this massive book that does all of the, goes through every single change and every edit and so on. And so when I showed the initial version of the interactive stuff to a Darwin scholar, it's like, who's going to want to look at this? This isn't interesting. We've already got the book. And so it looks something like this. But just this idea that we can actually take, what was this one book that's the purview of Darwin scholars, and instead put it online in a very simple interactive piece that can really widen the audience of people who can have access to it and can think about it, is really quite fascinating. The next iteration of that may not want to run. Nope, pardon me. The next iteration was taking the text and building out a composite version that actually shows how the book changed over time, which unfortunately but that was done for a different setting, for a gallery audience and so on, and also accompanied with a poster that you could actually see all of the text as well as sort of that, composite piece. So a little bit more direct than this sort of track changes thing. Pardon. But then a third version being, if you were actually looking at a different domain, so if you were trying to use this for a course or actually, really study these changes, this takes on a very different sort of form. And so that this is instead a tablet version that looks at, that the focus changes to how do you, compare between editions, and how do you annotate in different portions and things like that. And so just going with this idea that depending on the audience, depending on the context of use, there's a real shift, even though we're essentially dealing with the same underlying data and just different ways of thinking about it. Fast forwarding a couple years, for the last 7 years, I've been running a studio in Boston. This is our group. They are always this happy. Actually, this guy is leaving us, so apparently we're excited about him going. But this is one of the things that, we like the Darwin piece, one of the things that we try and do is to continue thinking about how to sort of pursue these different curiosities and sort of unpack different data sets that we're curious about. And this is an example of a project that Mark Schifferly in our studio did, where he was curious about Miles Davis and telling the story of all of his collaborators over time. Pardon? That he worked with some 600 different studio musicians over the course of his career, which is just sort of a phenomenal thing to think about. So this was the first draft version that he built. Is there anybody named John who played jazz? And so we can pull out these different pieces. Each of these dots is one individual person. But the thing is, what's happening here is it's really kind of, it has this sort of like data viz aesthetic thing that it's like a lot of thin lines and dots, and it's kind of obtuse. And hey, look, Miles Davis was on all of the Miles Davis albums. And so what we're always trying to do is figure out how to instead focus on what's a more direct way of telling that story about those collaborations. And so the final version that he created instead has this constellation at the top of these points. Each of these are individual musicians, and they're sized based on how many sessions they actually played on. And their horizontal location is kind of roughly the middle of their career of collaboration with Miles. And we put the timeline right in the center there, and provide a way to look at, so here's Herbie Hancock, and now I can look at every single session that Herbie Hancock did along with Miles Davis. And then, oh, that's interesting, so what about Michael Henderson with electric bass, and where are those intersections? And so hopefully here, getting closer to telling that story a bit more directly. And then we did a print version of it, so we weren't quite done with the interactive version, and so with print, totally different context, but you're in completely different set of affordances. So we have an enormous amount of detail that you can do in print that you can't do on screen, but you also can't click on things and hover things and be able to expand anything. So how do you, what's an appropriate representation for that information? And also, if it's a print, it needs to function as something that's that goes in your wall. So do you want this star field of dots, or do you want something that's more of a form that sort of says something a little different? And so this is the front sort of working. It's a timeline running in a sort of almost a little over 270-degree angle, sort of riffing off of a record. This is on the backside, all of the individual people, because what we wanted to see was, let's see all 600 people in one instance here, and be able to see all of those tick marks along the time scale. And James, who worked on the design for this, these were some of the images. He found this image of a record that he really loved, and sort of was keying off of that with this gold ink. This is this really wonderful microscopic version of what a record's groove looks like. We'd love to figure out a way of incorporating that. But then the poster itself looks like this with a few details. But just going to this idea of different mediums, different contexts of use have really very different representations and ways of thinking about the data. Because we can't play with Miles Davis records and Darwin all day, we also do some client things. This was a database from the Food and Agricultural Organization from the UN. We were contacted by National Geographic that they wanted to tell something about the story of food and consumption, and not consumption, but they're doing a whole series on the future of food. And FAO has this amazing database, and so they wanted to sort of find something interesting within that. So several iterations later, we wound up with this piece that looks at food consumption over time, and looking at that country by country. So with this chart, we've got the average daily calories, and then broken down by dairy and eggs, produce, sugar and fat, grain, etc. So here's sugar and fat. Yay, we're number one. Hooray for us. And we can run this back and see how this has changed over time, and just trying to pick out different ways of telling a story like this. And some of the affordances in terms of, is it grams per person that we care about? Is it calories per person? And that, just with some really simple interactions, we can switch. So grams of produce outweighs things, but it's a very different, has a very different meaning to it. Meat consumption, so then just taking that meat wedge and really looking at it closely. So world meat consumption is up 86% over 50 years. China's rise is really quite remarkable over that period. Here's the US, an incredible, so this chicken in every pot idea was this aspirational thing that, we now eat double the amount of chicken as we did 50 years ago. India, famously a lot of vegetarians, or predominantly vegetarian. Hong Kong on the rise. Russia, some ups and downs. But I think one of the things we love to see is where data sets like this really mirror what's happening in world events, what's happening historically. So here's the invasion of Kuwait in the Iraq War, and so this massive drop in terms of meat consumption within Kuwait, and similar types of things happening within Libya as well. That some of these you're seeing differences in terms of taste, and so with this, we started with just this raw data set, this massive set of tables, and culled it down to doing food and the actual consumption, and then country by country went through and sort of wrote these different pieces of text that actually provide context for what actually, so what's happening in Cuba here, where things drop off about 20, 30 years ago. And so being able to tell some of those stories backed by the raw data itself. But it's a very simple representation, but was kind of incredible as far as the reach that got, including 90s pop stars. So here's MC Hammer, What the World Eats, hashtag data science. And so, the thing that I love about, aside from it being MC Hammer, but the other part that I love about this, so here's a 90s pop star who's saying hashtag data science, and so the idea that data is even on his radar is really kind of amazing. So like for me, having, back when I was doing my master's or PhD, that plenty of people doing data work at the time, but that's seen such a massive shift in the last 10 years, in the last 5 years even. Last 20 years, people in the room have been doing it even significantly longer. But it says sort of a wonderful thing about this sort of zeitgeist, or maybe this is a little bit scary that people are paying attention to this. And the thing that within Fathom, the thing that I'm most interested in at the moment is this idea of things that are more platform projects. So the National Geographic thing is a matter of it's a couple weeks and one or two or three people kind of hashing out what's what the stories are, what the data, what slice of the data we actually want to work with. Can we actually say what we're saying with the data? Working with domain experts to say to sort that out. But I think a lot more interesting is where we can look at much larger data sets. And so we were contacted by Thomson Reuters to do a project on China during a couple years ago when the once in a decade transition was happening within the Communist Party. So basically the Politburo Standing Committee changes over every 10 years. There's an election. And so, this is a fascinating sort of story to tell in terms of how that's changing, who these people are, where did they come from, what's, there's just so many layers of this to actually get into. And so they wanted to build a tablet application out of that. And so we jumped at the chance to look at that, and that we're going to work with a series of a set of domain experts and researchers at Reuters who were going to be collecting all this data as we were doing the design for the actual piece and actually building all the infrastructure to support it. So the result, this is the resulting application. One of the sections is this social view, so basically looking at the soft connections between people. So here's Xi Jinping, the current president, and his social network, and the sort of different individuals that are actually connected to him. This view here, this is looking at the, it's called the institutional power view, and so it's instead the hierarchic version or the on-paper version of the way that these people are supposed to be related to each other. And so the social view is kind of the soft connections, the institutional is the hard connections, but within the application we can always move back and forth between these different representations. Politics in China is also extremely structured, that there are actual tiers that people can achieve, and so there's a timeline view there of being able to literally look at the arc of somebody's career in context. And then here kind of getting into Reuters' more typical bread and butter of reporting and in-depth articles and things like that. So behind all of this sits tens of thousands of entities, so an entity being an individual person or an organization or a company. In this final one, we had 30,000 relationships, but that varied over the course of the project, and then about 1.5 million words of text. And the whole point is to you never want somebody to actually sit at it and say, boy, this must be tens of thousands of things and 30,000 tens of thousands of relationships and millions of words. Another thing we enjoy about projects like this is really kind of getting into a new domain. So another, sort of referring back to the, why is design so fun? Here we can, this was one of the books that we read on, just understanding how politics in China actually works. And so, spending a couple months kind of really digging into that. And that data looks something like this. So we'll build something on these lines. This is just a sketch. This is a small fraction of, so this is a few hundred nodes, a few thousand edges, and what became that actual social power view, so the connections between people. And so we'll do something like this to say, all right, how much can we simplify this? Because this is a great example of what we never want to put in front of people, because it's like, oh, the data, it's complex. It's like, yeah, congratulations to me. It's complex. And that's kind of a typical thing for, watch out for folks working with data that way, because people like to brag about how complex their data is. And then this is that plus a round of design. So designers and developers working very closely together and saying, what are structures that we can start pulling out of this? And do we need the first degree connections or the second degree, or how far do we actually need to go to actually tell a decent story? And what we found was that we can actually do really focus on those first degree connections and have the second degree in the background, but that would actually give us enough meat to actually work. And so this is an example of something that we built in processing. Again, dealing with a fair amount of data, and then once we sort out what's happening here, we do a couple more rounds of design and then port it all into the JavaScript front end of this here, the final version of that representation. And we did a lot of tools like this. This is another one that so the size of each of those dots for the people in the representation, we figured out sort of a mix of an algorithm and a weighting system, but also actually having domain experts sit with us and tweak all of those weights and do that visually. So over here in the corner, those individual weights. Over at the left are the top few hundred most important people, and we basically use this to kind of figure out exactly how we wanted to group things. And just design-wise, this goes through an enormous number of iterations. This is what the very first version of what that front page looked like, the red screen with the icons. This was just a couple weeks into the project. Then it became this. This is a little too newsy. They said they wanted something really simple. We didn't really believe them, so we still had this paragraph of text. And they said, no, we really want this sort of 5-tier version. And so that's where we went with the final. But again, sort of rounds and rounds of design iteration, going back and forth with the client, working internally, working back and forth with the data, taking what we learned from the data, using that to feed into the design decisions. One of the things we found, originally this was going to be just 4 sections, and the career comparison data was just so interesting that we actually had to elevate that up. And so that, again, that's sort of seeing how those data sets evolve, and this is why we do data and design sort of under the same roof, that you can't sort of separate out the, Reuters doing all the IT stuff, and then we'll just kind of put a pretty front end on top of it. And also along with that, doing all of this is the whole back-end system that we built to support it, that we had no IT support within Reuters, so we needed to launch it straight out of EC2, actually have things up and running with production, and put it out to launch. And we didn't know who was going to show up or how many people would show up, and that needed to be just completely bulletproof. So the reaction, so the project went live at 4 o'clock one afternoon, and it was banned in China by the next morning, which was kind of fun because it was like, oh, that really does happen. That's a thing. And we also had things like a couple months later, but even in spite of that, we got an enormous amount of traffic. We had about 250,000 users in the first week or two, and then about 400,000 over the course of the first year or so. And so, with that, this is a slower reaction that came from the state news agency, that they're like, oh, you don't need this connected China thing. We have our own version, which is kind of great. And so, that it's all, here's Xi Jinping, and here's other lieutenants, and sort of putting this all together in one place. And, but this took several months for it to, come along, and, but just that this would also be like, oh, it's okay to ban that other thing because, we have this one. And, but also like that this one, it's interactive. So, woo. Pretty hot. This got derided over in the press over in Taiwan. But then even a little later, so Sina comes along with this, and we're like, that's amazing. And so the amazing thing for this being, if you've never had the experience of having somebody take, one of your projects and like reflect it back to you, it's really kind of incredible. The nav is on the right side, not the left side. But it's our exact colors lifted out, all these different details pulled out of it. We heard through the grapevine that they were, like, oh yeah, sign of the head of design there is a big fan. It's like, no shit. So kind of amazing. So an interesting iteration in terms of how the project took on these different forms. I think a thing I would love to do is be able to come back and do a version that's more situated for people within China, and actually really focus on particular audiences and different people who might use a tool like this and have an interactive version that's more pointed toward that. And so going off of the audience point, this last thing I would like to show is this No Ceilings project that we've been working on with the Gates Foundation and Clinton Foundation. And we were approached by them to look at the progress of women and girls over the last 20 years. And basically, can we collect enough data about that to actually be able to show where we are seeing progress, where we're seeing setbacks? Can we see some of these differences happening over time? Can we see our browser again? So this is a really simple visualization we have up front. This is the gender gap in workforce participation starting in 1995 and going through 2012. And so we can, just slowly see, so men in this sort of aqua color, women in orange, and sort of slowly seeing the in 100% labor force participation at the top, 0 at the bottom. And so over time we can see that condensing a little bit, perhaps not enough, definitely not enough, different ways of arranging the data. And so, and then also just individually looking at each of the countries involved. So each one of these lines is one country. And so that's one of, a dozen or so different visualization pieces that we built to support this work. And the thing that they wanted us to do was really to say, we need to be able to reach different kinds of audiences. And so they, in particular, they wanted to reach millennial women and policymakers, because they have the same interests and needs, and so and that we needed that it needed to be straightforward and approachable enough that people would be interested in sharing this and sharing it, and but also have enough depth that we could actually get back to all of the data. And so we have these sort of tear off things like this. So the U.S. is one of 9 countries worldwide that doesn't provide for paid maternity leave. So it's basically the U.S. and a bunch of island nations. It's actually really embarrassing. Huge gap in terms of women having internet access. So and you think about what internet access means in terms of development, in terms of how you get ahead, in terms of education, in terms of business, et cetera. This is a huge issue in terms of for women, and especially in the developing world. 1 in 3 women suffer physical or sexual violence, really upsetting. But then with this, we're always having this, about the data section, so we can get people back to the original sources, original studies, et cetera, instead of just kind of having these little tear-off, quotes that people like to, cite. But really, we want to make sure that the meat is still there and that people can, interact with that. And so the sharing portion, worked reasonably well. Here's folks on Twitter sharing out some of that work. Underneath, there's 850,000 data points that we put together, almost 1,000 indicators. Excuse me. Across just shy of 200 countries in 20 years. And so the data came to us looking like this. It's a couple 100,000 rows. Fascinating. And different themes and indicators, so themes like education and so on. And we built tools, as with the China project, very simple tool to look at each of these indicators, be able to map it out, see how it changes over time, see what our data coverage is like. There's these little pie charts. And so we build these sort of like hideous looking things that let us do some of the analysis and support some of the work and have, so that more people in the studio can actually be working with the data than just the developers or just the designers. And then from there, we start working on pulling out these different stories. This was another representation of just where the gaps are in the data, like how, so 1 row per indicator, horizontally it's each country, and just the intensity based on how much data we have for that item. Within each of those indicators, then trying to pull out different takeaways and stories. So here we can start seeing there's something interesting happening in sub-Saharan Africa, which is the darker colors, relative to, in terms of entrepreneurial activity across all these different countries. And so, very simple representation that we could then say, here's a story, here's a thread that we might work with, and then eventually work that into an actual visualization. And then doing this across, a couple dozen different themes, going back to the original sources, actually reading all these cheerful reports from the UN and World Bank and so on. And just having this system that works, from the top level, really simple shareable things to the, that middle level that I showed of, an actual visualization, to the bottom where, we actually had a version of that map that allows you to actually get access to every last bit of the data. And so here we can see how that plays out across, in this case, we're looking at child brides. So very simple representation of, number of girls under 18 who are married within a country, percent of girls who are enrolled in high school, and also girls under 18 who have given birth. And so, country by country, sort of seeing this is not a correlation so much as these are all factors that all have play, and be able to kind of look into some of what's actually happening there. The About the Data section goes through where is this data coming from? What does it actually mean? What are we talking about with each of these individual stats? And then you can go another level deeper and actually see all that data play out on the within that map view. And so if you really want to dig into every last piece of the information, you can do so. So really just trying to layer together. Let's get this really simple point up at the top, but then let people go as deep with it as they want to. And then doing other types of outputs. So here's WebGL version of the map running on the phone, smaller subset of data. Just interesting to get running there. But it's not a matter of like doing fancier and fancier representations. I think a lot of the data sort of speaks for itself. This is one of my favorites as far as it's just very simple bar chart, and here's Pisa math scores. So basically, math score in high school for women and men on the left-hand side, and then the percentage of women versus men who go into pursue careers within math. And we can argue about the last 10% of that or 20% of that, but we're talking about gaps like this. And so the same thing playing out in science, though less. In a less marked sort of way. And we put all the data up, so really what we want is for people to do their own things with the data and sort of take it in different kinds of directions. So so that's up at noceilings.org. I'd encourage you to check it out. The data itself is on GitHub. The info about that is on the site as well, but I'm curious to see what you might want to do with it. And I'll end there. So thanks very much.
We have time for some questions, and I'll let you just call on folks.
Great.
I'm curious about your dual charter to reach policymakers as well as millennial women. How successful do you think? Do you have any feedback about success with those groups?
We were more successful than we were pleasantly surprised with how successful it was. We were able to, the Google Analytics stuff actually gives us a decent set of feedback about different age groups and gender and things like that, and it's an approximation, but the kinds of things that we saw actually line up with real, let's see if I can find the chart. Line up with actual effects. And so we were very pleased with that. And also that the behaviors are totally different. So like basically that people under 30 were heavily skewed towards phone. People, during office hours were all, desktop and really digging into the policy stuff. And so kind of an amazing, let me see if I can find reports.
So does that dovetail with your decision for different presentation, different platforms?
Yeah,
for
so
specific audiences?
to my mind, what I would love to keep pushing on that further. So here's maybe the most direct version that we have of meeting these different audiences. So red, women on mobile; blue, women on desktop; purple, men on mobile; green, men on desktop. So this huge spike here, which is, so CGIU, it's a university-based Clinton Global Initiative event. And so here's this huge spike, and this is, I think, pretty evenly split between men and women who are participants. But when they demoed it on stage, here's all the women in the audience pulling out their phone and actually bringing this up, and some of the men. Chelsea Clinton goes on Kelly and Michael, so the morning show. TV drives an enormous amount of traffic still. And so here's women on mobile, and that skewed a little bit older, but actually was actually skewed younger than I would have expected. But basically it's the television's on, and I pull out my phone and kind of glance at this, so Chelsea Clinton says noceilings.org, and whew, it goes like that. Here is Hillary Clinton speaking to the UN the next day. Talking about status of women. And so I don't know if can't remember if she mentioned the site or if there was just other press, about the site going along with that. So here's women on desktop. So basically all the policy people, kind of showing up here. Here's Bill Gates and all of his Twitter followers, a bunch of men on desktop. So Gates posts about maternal mortality, and it's like all the Bill Gates wannabes all show up. And so, so it's an approximation, but this was one set of data, but we have other breakdowns that actually give us better numbers in terms of age ranges and things like that. So, but the other thing that we found was that I think because we were trying to hew so closely to the policy thing and really kind of make sure that any last statement that was made could be supported by policy, that the stuff was more, sort of more contained than it could be, and the mobile globe thing was like kind of an afterthought, and it wound up being one of the most compelling, most shared sort of things, and it's like, but you can't do analysis with it. Like it's a globe. It's on, but it's like, yeah, this is exciting. People were, sharing it around, and one of my favorite for that is one of the people in the studio, her younger sister. So she pulled out the mobile globe. So here she is, looking at the mobile globe. LOL, North Korea. That things aren't going that well in North Korea in terms of the internet usage stats. So, so here's a 20-year-old and their response to using this in the phone and whatever. So she's a character. Yep.
So many of us in the room today are interested in visualization to support research processes, whether it's exploring a data set or communicating results of a study or explaining a concept to novices or to students. And I'm wondering what you think we can learn about the process of designing representations from the kind of more traditional artistic community that really embraced the processing tools.
I think So for me, while doing say my postdoc and things like that, and while doing more of the, here's publication ready work and sort of explaining research to people and things like that, what I found was that it was informative. So it's actually that play between, so this was the research tool that folks were using internally. And I said, hey, you can redesign it and actually make it clearer. And really a lot of that has to do with removing things that are in the previous version to actually get a lot more clarity out of it. And they're like, oh yeah, great. And then it wasn't until I actually took the source code and rebuilt it and said, and here it is. And guess what? You can actually fit twice as much data on the screen. So I can shrink this down to half size and it's still readable versus this thing too. And so I think what happens is that so a lot of times for research findings and representation things like that, it's a lot of it is just simply the how to keep it as simple as possible, and what are the things you can take out of it to really focus on your specific point, or that one way I think about it is that so when you're writing a journal article, you can't really get away with just doing a bolded list of like, well, I found this and I found this and I found this, but the thing that people tend to do when they're making a chart or a graphic is I found this and I found this and I found this. And so the same way that you actually have to think about how this piece of text actually flows, and a paragraph has a topic sentence and things like that, your visualization has to do the same, type of thing. So what is the number one overall point that people are getting when they glance at this? And, with that in mind, is that the thing that color is assigned to, or is that the thing that's taking up the most space in it? It's a lot of really simple kind of things like that. But also to your question in terms of from the art community, so this is the version of, sort of combining these different representations, and, this isn't really the one that they want to use to replace that previous tool, but this is a really helpful exercise in terms of, oh, you know what, there's this really interesting thing about doing statistics with undo and also reworking that algorithm, because most of the time with this tool, people were just taking the default values and taking them as granted because it took 3 minutes to rerun the simulation. And so by making it an interactive thing, people actually started thinking more about like, oh wait, is this really a fragile stat that I'm working with, or is it, actually more robust than that, and so on.
Okay, cool stuff. You talked a little bit about people sharing the different projects. I'm wondering to what extent in any of the work, you tried to get people socially analyzing data on site, interacting through the work.
Not as much as I would like. I know, so like Martin and Fernanda have done some terrific stuff with that. I think it's for me, the piece of that I'm most interested in is, I think there's something fascinating about when we post something like this, or like, even if we post an article about, some of our work, people kind of lift, the phrases and text and things like that we use to describe the work. And it's always kind of, strange that it's, people kind of, play it back to us in this sort of, mirror version of what we had actually said. And what I would like to do is figure out how we can do that within visualization. So how can we sort of make these elements, but actually have it be something that's customizable and shareable, but they can actually kind of add a little bit of their voice to it. So how do they start working around the edges? I don't know exactly what that looks like, but that's kind of the, so the point would be, how do we give people the words? So like, here's what we found, and here's a visual language to talk about it. Now you take that visual language and then echo it back to other people. And so that's kind of the thing that's been rattling around a lot, especially on the no ceilings work, because of the way that people, I think one of the interesting things for the sharing was different pockets and different communities would pick it up and have a completely different take on the same data set relative to their community. So it's maternal mortality, those stats are going out, and it's, so Bill Gates has a specific take on it. Things are getting better, we're accomplishing these goals. This is one of the important Millennium Development Goals. Melinda Gates has a different take on it. These different policy people have another take on it. Land use people have another take, and so seeing those kind of things come back, but it would be, the ideal would be if we can actually arm those people with, those kinds of representations that they can kind of work with it, so.
Yeah, maybe just to follow up on that, the mini guys work, that was really exciting, because it seems like one of the really great things with visualizations is being a catalyst for discussion and being a place for that.
Yep.
Where do you see that going? Are there other efforts that we should?
Yeah, I haven't seen another one like Many. It's interesting because I think Many Eyes, if it were done 2 years ago, a year ago, it would be a completely different animal, because it was held up by people weren't really thinking about the social aspect, and definitely not the way people are now. They didn't have the distribution because IBM kind of owned things, and so there's a weird thing about people, uploading data to IBM, but then IBM didn't want to own how people were talking with the data, and that, that was tricky. But then once they sorted that out, then they were still dealing with like sort of clunky Java and Flash applet kind of things, and sort of how you share stuff out that way. And those pieces of calculus have actually changed drastically. And as you see with any newspaper that's doing a lot of interactive graphics work, online. And so I think present day you could, I don't know, all the pieces are there. So I'm kind of wait. I'm surprised actually that something hasn't actually reemerged.
Again, a follow-up on that. On the visualization, is there any way, I approach it more from an enterprise standpoint, where organizations themselves can visualize both the formal and informal organization.
Yep.
And what's very interesting is to take that visualization and integrate the interaction on the visualization itself. So that when people come on, they come on with their identity. They begin to interact as simply as like and dislike. And then that forms its own group. And from that group, you can build a collaborative or a set of collaborative networks.
Yep.
Anything like that happening at all?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you think about that if that were the, the China project, for instance, the people entering all of that data, they were using a, HTML 2.0 forms-based interface to like check different boxes and say this person was connected to this and whatever, and then that went through several, backflips before it became data that we could use, and or that the backflips we put it through to for it to be data that we could use in the front end. But you can imagine that being a very different kind of experience as far as using that tool and having it go all the way back through that that portion of it. But I don't have a good reference for it, but it's fun to think about.
Well, go ahead.
I'm wondering what sort of level of abstraction you've been able to achieve in creating your visualization. So just to say, you sort of work with a catalog of off-the-shelf visualization components that know how to do a particular graph or a particular chart or whatever, or have you managed to be able to say, okay, we want to map this kind of data to this dimension, like X or Y or radius or color or boldness of text or sort of thing, and then just sort of push a button and out comes a visualization that just sort of sticks and keys on it?
So my personal bias is way toward the end of the scale of not using, not doing off the shelf. So like I think one of the you can see that in say something like processing, where I never built a visualization library for processing and never wanted to turn processing into like the tool for building visualization, and like having sort of off the shelf pieces that would, because I kind of thought other people would do that. And for me, personally, the things that I find most interesting are, or I think that initial representation stuff, like getting up and running with a bar chart, doesn't tend to be the meat of, how the things that you're really going to struggle with over the course of the project. And so you can get through that part of the coding, but I want to keep things open enough so that you're not encouraged to sort of stop at the bar chart or stop at the network and things like that. And so, as much as possible, we really push on the custom things as much as we can. That being said, that for something like the no ceilings work, and we're cranking out a number of just sort of small, smaller interactive pieces. We did a lot of D3 for that. We did some 3JS for the the mobile globe, things like that. And so did more of the off-the-shelf stuff because that's what made sense for that, that particular context. And also in terms of the tools that we build, I would like to have more of those abstractions kind of ready to go to say, quick, let's get this in a map to see what it looks like and prove or disprove that it should actually be shown as a map. One of the things, say with the National Geographic food data, it's a great example of why not to show something as a map, because the geography of that data and the space used by that is maybe 5 or 6 in terms of the most interesting things about each of those data points and going country by country. And so we're often trying a lot of different things before we get to that final representation. So the more that I can encourage my guys to keep thinking broadly about that, that's kind of the stuff that we spend a lot of time struggling with.
Okay, let's thank Ben.
Great, thank you.